and welcome to this final episode of 2023 as we do an episode of History's All Right, where today, it's near the end of the year, looking towards the future, so let's talk about science fiction. Now, I'm not only joined by Jess, a very lovely cat, but we're also going to talk with the Ducking Historians on some ideas of how history can help us understand time and writing the future. So, first question you'll want to ask yourself, why are we writing science fiction? Now, this question probably applies to every setting, and you don't have to have some deep philosophical reason. Just bear in mind, the more distant your world is from the world your audience lives in, the more you'll have to world build and explain it to them. So that's the first thing to worry about, first thing to think about. But, as I say, you can have a fun reason, spaceships are cool, or you're wanting to explore some ideas. Now, obviously, the idea of exploration, allegory, all that stuff, that's going to come in a future video due to the fact that, exploration, emotion, and escapism really are their own topics, and not unique to science fiction. So let's ask an interesting thing about that, because of course often with science fiction technology is a big factor. Now, the way Ed likes to think about technology is more a sort of phase-based thing, whereby something starts off as being discovered, then once prototypes have been developed and we've worked out how to do it, but it really does cost a lot, it sort of becomes a bit of a luxury item. There was a time where not everyone could own a motor car. Now they're much more common. And so we get the social discourse as to what to do with them. So, for example, with, roughly speaking, what Ed likes to use is three broad categories. One is the idea that a new technology is prohibited or restricted or regulated being a better word, whereby this is what most commonly happens with technologies. There are rules in place, standards they have to follow, all that stuff. We're all kind of used to that idea. Most things done that. But there are also things such as public, a public good, which is made available to people for a desired social end. When Ed had our MRI earlier this year, this was done by the National Health Service for a social good, rather than done privately, based on the supply and demand of the market, which is another way you can distribute your technology. But usually these will all work together. So, for example, a road is a piece of technology, as it were, because it is a path made for the transfer of vehicles and people between places, and built for various reasons, either for a social good, or because there's a market demand. Anyway, that sort of basic economics is there. And then, of course, an item can become a piece of technology can become part of the ordinary everyday. Take, for example, this. Ed, would you like to explain it? Of course. So you see, this is a great plastic ball cast in the great shape of a celestial lunar object. And from it, inside its inner workings, are two tubular constructions of metal and liquid, which encapsulate a great elemental force of electricity, and by my adjustment of this analog signal, make forth the luminescence by sending forth the electrodes and electrons and this great elemental force through the filament to make luminescence. One of my friends got me this for Christmas. Now, obviously that explanation of how the lunar light works is probably a bit pretentious. Of course, we understand that. But back in the day, there was a time where such luminescent technology, as the light bulb, would bring some trepidation, some excitement, but now it's become part of the ordinary everyday. So, when your characters in the future encounter a technology that perhaps doesn't exist in our world, but has been brought into this one, remember, sometimes a piece of technology is new. And if it's new and exciting, people will probably have different excitements and apprehensions about it. But if it's relatively common, then it won't be so amazing. Which is probably why some people bring a present-day character into the future to help explain that to the audience. But in fact, a good way of showing the idea that this new fancy technology is part of the ordinary everyday is by having people just, you know, treat flying on a spaceship to a distant galaxy with very little difference to getting on the bus, us into town. That'll show everyone this technology is very new, is very, well, known to people. It will be new to your audience, but not new to them. Now, of course, technology doesn't have to be physical. It can be conceptual. Hours and minutes had to be invented. Marketplaces, you know, even the physical marketplace at one time was an invention rather than just everyone happening to come about at a certain place. The street, which, you know, as people talk about with motor cars, had to be discovered, as it were. And then the questions of, well, who's this street for? So your world might, for example, have people using this relatively familiar concept of a street in a way very different to our own, depending on the social needs, institutions and circumstances for how these have come about. Of course, it's not just the social aspects of science fiction, the technological stuff. After all, here's a simple thing. Why should the social relationships of the present be placed into the future? You can explore this if you want to, or not if you don't. Different institutions might be balanced differently in a sci-fi world compared to ours. And equally, people will have different sense of ideas of what should and shouldn't be, how things are. And these kind of perspectives, if you want to go in depth on that, you can show people why each character feels the way they do about how their world or this new technology is. Depends on the reason for your sci-fi setting, of course, because sometimes You know, sometimes science fiction isn't about exploring a new technology, but about something else. Else with science fiction being like a backdrop, sometimes just a fun backdrop, but what have you. Not to mention, you know, sometimes they talk about magical realism where a fantastical element is brought into our modern world. Well, you can do that with science fiction as well. After all, take, for example, the DK Multimedia game, My First Amazing History Explorer, which Ed's played a lot of, and still does, on her retro computer. Point is, when you're doing this kind of science fiction, you've brought the time machine, an item of technology that doesn't exist in our world, but use it, in this case, to explore the world of history and the 8 historical periods: ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, imperial China, medieval Europe, Inca Empire, Age of Industry, and the 1920s. But the science fiction element of the time machine is just placed into the ordinary world to create a sort of extraordinary adventure. Funnily enough, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine would do the same thing with his Victorian world, with him going into the future with his time machine rather than the past. And the science doesn't have to be explained. In fact, neither neither My First Amazing History Explorer nor The Time Machine explain the science behind how these time machines work. Which then, obviously, brings us to the idea of how do we interact with this world? How do our characters interact with this world? And of course, if this might contrast with, say, how you as an individual or you as a reader would contrast with this world, it's all very kind of different, or the same, and it'll create different kinds of effects depending on how these things work. What language will they speak? What kind of language? You know, what will be seen as more elegant? What will be seen as more idiotic, you know? Will people view the use of long words as a sign of sophistication or of pretentiousness? It will affect how your world is perceived and affect how your world is understood. Good. Well, just like to thank the Ducking Historians and Jess. And, oh, we got another little intro. Yes, and I'd just like to say, as the elephant in the room, this probably needs addressing. But if you're creating a world based in the future, and it feels like it's just, and you're trying to work out how to explain it to people, the question is, how do you do that? Now, one thing a lot of world builders, Ed included, does is go into a bit of a soliloquy about the world. This is probably not a very good idea, as it will feel more like a documentary at best, or propaganda at worst. But now, if you wish to convey a point, fair enough. That's all fine. But your best way of conveying the world is to display to your audience how it's meaningful to whichever character or characters are the point of view of the story. Because those are the people are following. Have it impact them. Because very few people get into a philosophical soliloquy about what's going on in the world. Just off the cuff. And so, as a world building technique, it will probably come across as very forced, tiresome, and people might well just switch off. Now, if you're going for a more documentary style, sort of fly-on-the-wall approach, this can work. Especially, you know, if you're trying to make it a bit sort of neutral, factual, kind of explaining where you want to keep the focus on the ideas rather than the emotions or the individuals involved. And we'll probably cover writing ideas in a future video. But just remember, trying to fit world building around the adventure that your characters are on is probably the best way forward for, you know, helping your audience understand, empathize, and convey these kind of what you're trying to discuss in your work. Unless, say, you're going on a sort of more documentary style. There. Well, thank you for that. Thank you to Jess for joining us this video. She didn't say too much, but she is a cat. And thank you for having me round. Thank you for enjoying. Well, hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you enjoyed 2023 as much as you could. You know, I guess it could have gone better for a lot of people out there. Thank you again for watching this video. And however your 2024 goes, it was lovely having you here.